So far, we've seen that generally speaking, a plaintiff to establish intent usually must satisfy either of the two tests for intent, that is, that the defendant desired or knew to a substantial certainty that he or she would bring about a forbidden harm. But there's yet a third way that a plaintiff can establish intent, and it's through the doctrine called transferred intent. Now, you've already been exposed to this in a previous video, but I'm going to use the Hall versus McBride case to give you hopefully a deeper understanding, or at least to review some of what you've already learned. So in that case, we know that Marcus McBride was visiting his parents' home where he discovered a gun, and while he was there, some boys in a car drove by firing a gun at Marcus's house. And Marcus pulled out his loaded weapon and started firing back at the car. But Marcus didn't hit the boys in the car. He wound up striking an innocent bystander who happened to be one of his neighbors. So the neighbor who was struck in the abdomen is the plaintiff. Marcus, who was firing at the car, is the defendant. The neighbor is suing Marcus for battery because he suffered a harmful contact to his abdomen. And the question here is going to deal with intent, but even more specifically, whether or not we can transfer Marcus's intent to perhaps cause an assault to the boys in the car to culminate the battery suffered by the neighbor. Now, in this case, at the trial level, the trial court didn't believe that Marcus had the intent to batter the boys in the car because he really wasn't trying to strike them. And because he didn't have an intent to batter, the court felt like the transferred intent doctrine could not apply. And as a result, the court winds up entering a judgment for Marcus. Now, the appellate court, when it gets this case, reviews the transferred intent doctrine, and it specifically looks at the restatement second of torts, section 16. And there the restatement makes it clear that there can be actually two forms of transferred intent. One is a person-to-person transfer. So if the defendant intends to harm one person, but his or her act winds up causing harm to a completely different person, the defendant's intent can be transferred from the intended victim to the actual victim. The second form of transferred intent is tort-to-tort. Here, if the defendant intends to commit one type of tort and a different type of tort results, the court can transfer the intent for the intended tort to culminate a completely different tort. Historically, courts have allowed the transfer of intent among 5 different torts. That is, the intent to commit an assault or a battery or a trespass to land could transfer, but the intent to commit an intentional infliction of emotional distress cannot. So just to clarify, if the defendant intends to commit a battery, but an assault occurs, the court would be willing to transfer the battery intent to culminate the assault, and vice versa. Really, this is a policy-based supplement to the intent requirement, because notice that the defendant does not need to satisfy either of the two traditional tests for intent, but yet the court is still willing to hold the defendant responsible as if the defendant did have that intent. And it's really just based on the policy objective that we want to encourage people to think before they act. That if you are going to commit an act against one person and it turns out that you wind up injuring somebody else, we'd like you to think before you act so that perhaps you don't injure anybody at all. So that's what the transferred intent doctrine is really about. Now, in this case, once the appellate court gets a hold of it, the appellate court says that this is kind of a classic example of transferred intent. In fact, both forms of transfer intent seem to apply here. Marcus had intended to assault the boys in the car. That is, he was really trying to scare them, not necessarily trying to shoot them. An assault is placing somebody in an apprehension or an awareness that they're about to be contacted. So it does appear that Marcus was trying to commit an assault against the boys in the car. But we now know that Marcus wound up committing a battery against a completely different person, our plaintiff, who was the neighbor standing away from the car. So the court can transfer the intent to commit the assault against the boys and culminate the battery that was sustained by the neighbor who was standing behind. Ultimately, the court decides, based on the application of the transferred intent doctrine, that Marcus, in fact, could be liable for battery to the neighbor, and therefore remands the case back for a determination on that issue.